My name's Chris Birkett. I'm the head of regulation at the HTA with responsibility for our regulation of human tissue research and related policy development. I also have responsibilities for the anatomy sector, and I'll be giving a webinar for that sector in a couple of weeks. I'm joined by a very small technical team just to make sure that things can be put right if they go wrong during the webinar today, but I'm sure they won't. So I'm joined by Maria Sakaris, who's our Stakeholder Engagement Manager, and Matt Silk, who's our Head of Communications, and they'll be making sure that everything runs smoothly. Supporting me in the room are also two members of my team, Fiona Milady-Crowe and Chris Perrett, who are both regulation managers with research backgrounds, and they'll be keeping me on the straight and narrow, I hope. And I believe we're expecting possibly a few more participants, possibly up to 60 from around the UK, so thank you very much for joining us. And as I say, if anybody has any trouble with the technology during this session, please let us know by sending us a message through the chat pane, which you can probably see on your screen, I hope, and we'll attempt to fix it if we can. So, before I take you through the main changes to our research code, I wanted to remind you of the status of our codes. Here is an extract from Part 2 of the Human Tissue Act, which I'll also read out. The HTA may, in carrying out its functions with respect to licenses, take into account any relevant observance of or failure to observe a code of practice when dealing with a matter dealt with in a code. So really that's to emphasise that the codes are important resources for you to draw on and rely upon in terms of demonstrating your compliance with the regulatory framework. The Human Tissue Act also stipulates that the codes should give practical guidance and set out the licensing standards. So this webinar and all the webinars is happening at the end of work that began in the in autumn of 2014 to review and revise our codes and standards. During 2015, we carried out a full public consultation and held workshops in London, Leeds, Belfast and Bridgend, and they were attended by about 200 people. Responses were positive, constructive, and I'm sure many of you will have contributed or at least followed developments with interest. The codes and the standards that are contained within them finally received parliamentary approval in December, which means, as planned, they'll come into force on the 3rd of April this year, and we'll be regulating under them from that date. The proposed codes and standards have been on our website for over a year, and we've worked hard to provide lots of information about them on our website and through general and specific newsletters. In other words, nothing in the webinar should be a surprise to anyone, but it's useful to have a refresher before the revised codes and standards come into force. Just a reminder that our new suite of codes comprises of 7 rather than 9 codes. We no longer have separate codes on disposal or on import and export. Instead, guidance on disposal and import and export is actually in the individual codes where it's relevant. And the idea behind that move is so that the advice is tailored more to the needs of each sector. Code A remains the overarching code, so there's still an overarching code, and that includes information that anyone involved in licensed activity should read, regardless of sector. We've had one webinar on that code, and that recording will be made available. The purpose of this webinar is to take you through the main changes to the research code and standards, and I want to put an emphasis on how these changes might impact on your day-to-day work to make it more practically useful to you. The research code is unusual in our suite of codes as it's relatively new, having been published for the first time in 2009. However, our standards have not changed since we began inspecting, and so we've taken this opportunity to undertake a full review, but more about the standards later. This slide that I'm showing you at the moment, I think will be quite familiar to people who attended the consultation workshops and looked at the consultation at the time. You'll probably remember it. It just gives a visual reminder of the changes we've made to the suite of codes. So just to say again, the import and export and disposal codes have gone. Those topics are covered in the relevant sector codes. And again, Code A is the overarching code, and the sector code should be read alongside that main overarching code. So in terms of the major changes, generally what's different with the new research code, disposal and import and export information are now in the research code rather than being separate codes themselves. And more than half of the new code is new. So it's either completely new text or it's updated text from an existing code of practice. It may be text from one of the decommissioned codes. It may be text that's been published in guidance since the previous code was published in 2009. And some of the text in the new code has arisen from inspections and inquiries. So in summary, very little has actually been removed from the code, but a lot of text has been added. So it is a bigger code of practice than it was before. In terms of the specifics, what is different, there are more examples to reflect current practices, and there's new information on cost recovery and charging, consent requirements for DNA analysis, licensable storage and what that is and what that should be considered to be, research tissue banks and diagnostic archives, and some text on xenotransplantation as well. In terms of cost recovery and charging, the text in the revised code builds on previous guidance in one of our e-newsletters. It emphasises that you can charge for providing tissue samples to researchers, including those working for private companies, but it underscores the importance of transparency in ensuring informed consent. For example, informing donors that their tissues may be shared subject to a fee being charged. We also recommend that you provide information on how and why you charge and to whom tissues may be supplied. In terms of the consent requirements for DNA analysis, there isn't much DNA guidance in the current research code, but clearly genetic associations are becoming increasingly important in health-related research, and so there's more DNA guidance in the new research code. Some of the text in the new code has come from the section on DNA in the current consent code, so there's been a bit of moving around of text between the codes, but in short, there's more information in the research code than there used to be, and that's mostly clarifications around the offence and also the work that we've done with HRA about acellular material, which isn't covered by the Human Tissue Act, but is becoming of increasing relevance to researchers. We understand that the HRA will be including this position in their upcoming revision of GAFREC, which is the Governance Arrangements for Research Ethics Committees. That's the policy framework which governs NHS research ethics committees and describes what is expected of them when reviewing research proposals. There's also more information on licensable storage with greater clarification of the exceptions to the requirement to hold a license for storage and more examples. There's more information on research tissue banks and diagnostic archives, and that's really building on the position statement that's been on the website for a while, but was sort of between the two codes. It's now in the current code, and it clarifies the difference between diagnostic archives and tissue banks and the different licensing requirements. And there's also some text on xenotransplantation, and that clarifies that a license may be needed when tissues and cells are being stored for a scheduled purpose before they're transplanted into a recipient species. Researchers should also inform donors and get their consent if the use of their tissues will likely involve the transfer of material to animal models. So I'm hoping that gives you a good overview of the new bits of the code of practice. I wasn't going to spend any more time than that on those bits, because a lot of it represents guidance that has existed for a while now, but is now transitioned into the code. That said, I thought the more useful bit of this presentation would be on the actual standards themselves. It's actually been quite we've actually had quite a lot of, we've been discussing the standards quite a lot, but we haven't had a lot of conversations back from people about the standards. So I think this is an area worth concentrating on, just so that you're absolutely in the picture when the standards begin to be an issue for you from April onwards. So let's get to the detail of the revised standards a bit more. The first thing at this point that I want to emphasize is that I'm confident you will be familiar with what we expect. And that's because our data shows that the research sector is a high-performing sector, and the principles that underpin our expectations haven't changed. So although the revised standards do raise the bar, you already have a good idea of where the bar is set. And because the revised standards have been available for over a year, you'll be familiar with them. So in the next section on the standards, I want to explain how we've gone about revising them, and then give you the information you need in order to check that you meet them. So more usefully, I'll be telling you what our inspectors will be looking for. So we felt the codes weren't too badly out of date, but we did feel the standards were due a major review after 10 years. So we've had, just to give you the context, we have had 10 years with the same licensing standards, which means we've got 10 years of experience of which standards work well. And we've also got 10 years of hard data, compliance data, to check against the anecdotal and qualitative evidence that we have about the standards. Reviewing our standards has provided an opportunity to reflect the changes that we've seen in the sector since we began inspecting. We really were keen to have a set of objectives that would make them clearer, to improve compliance, to raise the bar, to reflect our learning, and also to make them more useful to us in terms of reflecting back compliance information and the patterns of compliance that we see from our inspections. I mean, overall, we found that many of the standards continue to fulfill their purpose, which is to enable us to make judgments about the suitability of premises and practices. We decided early on that we would maintain consistency across our human tissue sectors. So whichever licensed activity you're involved with, you'll be required to meet standards drawn from the same principles on consent, governance and quality, traceability, and premises, facilities, and equipment. I think this is particularly useful for anyone who works across sectors or who has responsibilities for a range of licensed activities. In revising our standards, we look back at our inspections data to assess the continued relevance of each standard and the patterns of compliance, to identify where there was scope to remove a standard or strengthen it or add a new one. We obtained early input from sector experts as critical friends, and we involved our regulation managers whose knowledge individually and collectively about how establishments are meeting our standards has been important in informing where we should place more emphasis. We also made sure that our revised standards continued to meet the requirements of the Regulators Code, and that our approach was consistent with good regulation. Regulators must have regard to the code when developing policies and operational procedures that guide their regulatory activities and when setting standards or giving guidance. Amongst other things, we must carry out our activities in a way that supports those we regulate to comply, provide simple and straightforward ways to engage with those we regulate and to hear their views, and also to base our regulatory activities on risk and provide clear information, guidance and advice to help those we regulate meet their responsibilities to comply. So in terms of the main changes to the standards, the most important and most obvious improvement is that the standards have been restructured. For example, we've moved disposal into a new group of standards to recognise the importance of traceability and recognise disposal as the endpoint of traceability, if you like. We've consolidated requirements where there are similarities to create clearer and more specific standards. These do set a higher bar, but we believe it will be clearer for establishments to understand how to meet the standards and what is expected from them. I'm sure you'll have noticed from the revised standards on our website that there's been a change in formatting and structure. Until now, in other words, currently, we have 18 individually numbered standards, C1, C2, C3, PFE 1 to 5, etc., each with examples of how establishments can evidence their compliance against a standard. This is allowed for flexibility, but sometimes it's left establishments unclear about what precisely they have to do to demonstrate that a standard is met. So taking examples of evidence together currently, the current research standards amount to 65 possible requirements. The new set of standards consist of 47 separate standards, which seems proportionate and fair and much clearer. A further benefit of the formatting change is that we'll be able to analyse the data more easily and more specifically on specific points and feed that back to the sector with regard to trends in compliance and sharing learning. A really important development is the inclusion of standard-specific guidance. So these items of guidance are not contained within the code, but they are available in separate documents. And the reason why I've done this is that we can readily review and update the supporting guidance on an ongoing basis, which is much harder to do if we have to do that through a code. And being able to update the guidance means that we can reflect current good practices and share learning across the sectors. And that way, we hope to keep pace with the way that you work, and you will always be able to refer to an up-to-date guidance document. As I say, I'm sure you'll have seen the new standards and you'll be familiar with the old ones, but I just wanted to just give a little example of the way things have been restructured. So the current GQ2 standard there is a documented system of quality management and audit. And in the current standards, each standard is supported by examples of how establishments can demonstrate their compliance. And these are often used as a checklist. However, not all the examples are applicable. So the standard is as set out there. There's a documented system of quality management and audit, and the examples of how to comply with that standard are listed below that as bullet points. So there's a document control system, schedule of audits, change control mechanisms. That's the current set out for that standard. In the new standards, which I'll show you on the next slide, this is the revised GQ2. And for the new standard, we have an overarching statement followed by standards themselves. So this example here shows how GQ2 has been revised and demonstrates that the new standards are grouped under an overarching statement or theme, which makes the standards more specific. And each of those standards, where appropriate, will be accompanied by guidance notes which provide advice and set out our expectations to help you reach compliance. So in this example on audits, the guidance notes cover matters such as why audits are important, different types of audits that can or should be done, and how audits should be managed or carried out. And don't worry, the original GQ2 included aspects of quality management. These haven't been lost. They've been included in specific standards of their own elsewhere with guidance notes, of course. So I'm going to move on to the new standards themselves. In fact, I've just jumped on a slide. Apologies for that. I need to go back. Let me go back. Yeah, so sorry, this should be the consent standards. There are now two consent standards, C1 and C2. Again, C1 is about consent being obtained in accordance with the legal and regulatory requirements, and the standards themselves cover forms and procedural documents, agreements with third parties where consent is being sought elsewhere, and also it includes standards around the information to support the seeking of consent, which was covered previously in our current standards, if you like, under what was C2. The new C2 is a bit like the old C3, which is about training and support for staff seeking consent, and the standards there will cover staff training records and that competency staff is demonstrated and maintained. In terms of consent standard C1, the guidance notes for the standards under C1 include guidance on consideration of legal requirements such as Data Protection Act and the common law duty of confidentiality, guidance on the content of agreements with other parties responsible for seeking consent, so that the consent is obtained in accordance with legal and regulatory requirements. And also there is also information that signposts you to template research consent forms and participant information sheets, which are, for example, provided by the Health Research Authority. There's also, in terms of C2, the guidance notes for the standards under C2 include information that consent training is not considered a one-off event, and it also has some general guidance about proficiency and training good practice, for example, on the frequency of training, which essentially is about there not being a set frequency, but the factors to take into account when considering how often training should occur. We'll move on to the GQ standards, which is the Governance and Quality Systems Standards. I'm just going to cover GQ1 and GQ2 together on this slide, but obviously there are more of them. You'll be pleased to hear. So GQ1 is about documented policies and procedures as part of overall governance, and the standards below that overarching theme are about ensuring that the documents are approved and are sufficiently robust that people can follow them. That the documents are controlled, that there are governance meetings, and also that there's a complaints system as well. In terms of the guidance notes to support those standards, we've included our expected SOPs, the typical structure for an SOP, how SOPs should normally be managed, and their specifications. We've also included some advice on document control, the features of document control, some advice on governance structure, for example, about governance meetings, quality management framework advice, and also this is really arisen from practice that we've seen on inspections, good practice that we've seen on inspections. Advice on adopting a harmonised approach to sample management, as there are risks of varying practices where samples being stored for REC-approved projects are being managed differently to samples subject to HTA's licensing standards. So there's some advice on that as well. In terms of GQ2, the theme for GQ2 is about audits, and so there are specific standards under GQ2 about an audit schedule and the management of audits. In terms of the advice notes, there is general advice on auditing good practice from our perspective, for example, the types of audits and how audit arrangements can underpin good governance. So if I move on to GQ3, the theme for GQ3 is about staff training in general, and there are specific standards under GQ3 about training records, induction, and appraisals and PDPs being in place. The guidance notes for GQ3 include guidance which is really general good practice on training, but not much, as the standards themselves are very specific. GQ4 is about records management, to do with how records are created and reviewed, amended, retained and destroyed. There is another standard about the need for backup systems and recovery, and also systems to support data protection, confidentiality and public disclosure. The guidance notes to GQ4 cover records format and storage, and reference to other relevant legislation on personal data and confidentiality. So now on to GQ5 and 6. GQ5, the theme for GQ5 is adverse events, and the standards cover whether staff know what to do, and also cover corrective and preventative actions and the follow-up for adverse events. The guidance notes to accompany these standards include guidance on good practice on adverse incident handling, for example, the features of a good system. And I just want to emphasise, as I'm sure you know, there are currently no requirements to report adverse incidents to the HTA, but there is guidance which you'll be familiar with already probably, which encourages you to contact us and give some illustrative examples to guide you in that. GQ6 is about risk assessments, and so there are specific standards under GQ6 which cover the need for risk assessments to be documented and to cover the sort of Human Tissue Act risks rather than just health and safety ones. There is a standard about the risk assessments being reviewed regularly and also staff awareness and training. The guidance notes to GQ6 cover what the risk assessment should cover, what risks should be assessed, and also some general good practice about when they should be reviewed, etc. Now, the next group of standards are a new set, but they are actually derived from the previous other existing standards. But this is a new set of standards. We've removed the set on disposal, but as I was saying earlier on in the presentation, there are disposal requirements within this new group of traceability standards. So for ease of reference, the traceability standards are T1 and T2, two main standards. T1 is about coding and records to facilitate traceability and audit, and the standards under this theme relate to having a unique coding system, to create and apply code. Also, how samples are registered and how that's maintained. Standards that support full auditability, particularly where there is transfer occurring, and also there's a standard about records which relate to transport, delivery, transfer and courier agreements. And the guidance notes supporting the standards around T1 include guidance on the need to track ethical approval expiry dates, and also any conditional consent agreements that that people have made when they've donated their tissue and how that's tracked. Standard T2 is now covers now the disposal requirements, which really has just standards that make sure that disposal is linked to the advice in the codes, and also that it's documented. And there's some general guidance in the notes about disposal records and documentation to support those standards. And then the final group of standards is on-premises facilities and equipment. There are 3 PFE standards in the new set of standards. PFE1 is around premises being secure and fit for purpose. So the standards underneath the theme of PFE1 are to do with the fact that the premises have been assessed to be fit for purpose, and that's been carried out and can be demonstrated, that security and confidentiality is maintained, and that there are documented cleaning and decontamination procedures. The guidance notes to support the standards under PFE1 include guidance on establishments being clean, well maintained and subject to a programme of planned preventative maintenance, that there is periodic review of risk assessments of premises, facilities and equipment, that there are environmental controls to avoid contamination, that there are appropriate security measures, that there are policies to maintain and review the safety of staff, visitors and other relevant people such as students or doctors, and that there are cleaning and decontamination procedures supported by schedules. Obviously, this is this is an overview of the guidance notes. The guidance notes go into more detail about these matters. Standard PFE2 is about there being appropriate storage for relevant material, and the standards underneath this theme relate to having sufficient capacity, ensuring the dignity of the deceased, making sure that storage conditions are monitored, recorded and acted on when required, and that there are documented contingency plans. And in terms of the guidance notes, I'll just give you a brief overview of the guidance notes that accompany PFE2, but they're really containing guidance on um, on documented temperature monitoring and trending to detect failures before they happen, on defining and signposting alarm set points, maximum and minimum set points, remote monitoring and call-out systems, documenting checks and fills of liquid nitrogen dewars if that's relevant. Also, it covers the point that we often pick up on inspection, which is where material can be stored at room temperature. This doesn't mean that the storage conditions don't need to be monitored. And also, there's some general guidance on ensuring that the environment is safe for staff and the labelling of storage equipment to maintain quality, safety, security, and prevent mix-ups with other tissues if that's relevant. And then finally, PFE3, that's the last in this group. The overarching theme here is really about equipment, and the standards underneath this theme focus in on making sure that essentially that equipment is maintained and calibrated appropriately, and that users know how to use that equipment and know how to report problems, and that staff are provided with appropriate personal protective equipment. And the guidance notes that support the standards under this PFE3 include good practice principles on equipment being appropriate for use, and things such as having a system to renew items that are no longer serviceable. So that was quite a thorough run through of the standards. I hope that makes sense, and I hope you didn't fall asleep, because I realise it's quite late in the day and there's quite a lot of information to cover. I'm sure the questions will come through if it didn't make sense. I just wanted to cover in this last substantive slide the way that we categorise shortfalls. I'm hoping that most of you will be familiar with the concept of shortfalls, where establishments are found not to be meeting standards, and we classify that not meeting of a standard as a minor or a major or a critical. Obviously, critical being the most serious, and majors being intermediate, and minors being the most common type of shortfall. And I've included this because I think it's relevant to remind ourselves of how we do this, but also I really wanted to underscore that compliance in the research sector is very good. In our review of research inspections published last year, there were only 5 major shortfalls in 87 inspections, which is pretty good, and also no shortfalls at all in 55% of those 87 inspections. So I hope that sort of gives yourselves some sort of reassurance and confidence that actually you're already largely meeting the standards. And I think the way that we've restructured them will make them even clearer for you to make sure that you're meeting them, but also to sort of intermittently audit yourself against them. So we hope that you will continue to meet our standards, and look forward to continuing to support you in the months and the years ahead.